Thank you, Joshua, and thank you to our panelists. Ideally, if we had the time, I'd like to give the panelists a chance to interact with Josh, but I think we really need to allow our viewers to become involved by having the opportunity to ask a question. We have less than 20 minutes left, and then the AAR will cut us off. Now, I'm not exactly sure how to access the questions. Let's see, I see something now appearing on the screen saying, put your question here.
It's in the chat. If you click on the chat button.
You think it's in the chat?
But no one's actually chatted anything yet, so we can take questions until they put something.
So this is different than the one we did at the EPS where we had the Q&A button.
That's right.
So this is going to be under chat if anyone has a question. Until we hear from them, then, let me ask if there is any panelist who would like to make a point in response to Josh.
If you'll allow me two or three very quick comebacks. Josh, I loved your response, and I love the thoughtful nature of your book, and I love the questions you're trying to address. And I've enjoyed being on Peaceful Science, so thank you for that initiative. It struck me that the single most disingenuous thing you said, however, during your response was, and I quote, "I don't care about Adam and Eve per se." For somebody who doesn't care about Adam and Eve per se, to write an entire book about Adam and Eve is a little bit like, you're kidding me. And my point about complexity goes to this, and this I'll make it very brief. And that is, look, I'm a scientist and as an educator, as you are. In effect, part of our job is explaining complexity. So I'm cool with that. I'm happy to do that. But in this particular case, I think the complexity of your model comes across as being contrived. And that was the reason it was a criticism. That's all I have to say. And I hope there will be some questions from our audience.
There's a comment from someone, that's not a question.
All right. Let me just look at what it says here in the chat from Dale Brueggemann. This has been a moving interaction, and I hope that Christ can redeem the wasteland. Not really a question. From Royce Anderson, I've raised my hand. Do you see it? May I be unmuted for a brief question or comment?
Well, I think he put his, maybe you just put it into the chat and we'll answer it. So Seth,
okay, yeah, because I don't
so we can actually
on my
question and do that
thing. Let's see, scrolling down.
Bill, I think you as the host, under the when you go to the participants, you can unmute Dr. Anderson.
All right, so I'm going to read Seth's question while you figure out the thing with Royce. So he says, my question
here, Josh, that's up from Seth.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question regards John Walton's book, The Lost World of Adam and Eve. Walton drives a hard line between the creation of humanity in Genesis 1 and the man in Genesis 2-3. How much weight do you give to his idea and his division based on the definite article? I'd love to hear what Michael Heiser has to say about this as well. He did speak to that issue. Michael, would you like to follow up briefly on Seth's question?
Yeah, I think...
let me just answer first though here. What I would just say is that there appears to be a pretty large debate among the exegetes here. So Jack Collins and I think Mike Heiser and a few others really don't agree with John Walton here, but I've also come across several exegetes that really think differently about this. And I would say is that what I'm saying doesn't really depend on whichever way you go, though I do think if you take John Walton's view, it does very much seem to suggest people outside the garden much more strongly, though I do think, I mean, Mike, you can explain why you really think it's not a good interpretation.
Yeah, I think Genesis 5 undermines it. You know, reading the ESV, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Okay, so we've got Adam without, you know, the definite article. Okay, so we have the proper name issue. So that's Adam. When God created man, there's your, your sort of your more neutral reference. He made him in the likeness of God. Well, that second phrase, when God created man, also lacks, the definite article. So, it's very easy to argue that both Adam and generic humanity are linked together by this wording, because made him in the likeness of God, that takes you back to Genesis 1. So I don't know how you dichotomize Adam as the individual and humanity based upon the presence or absence of the definite article, because they get combined here in Genesis 5. So to me, that undermines the argument that you try to make in between Genesis 1 and 2. Well, let's not just throw Genesis 5 out of the question here. It matters because it references both of those things. So that's what I would say.
All right, we have another very interesting question, Josh. Josh's model is based upon the notion that given enough time, there would be a common universal ancestor behind a vast population. But Timothy Manis asks a question. You locate the genealogical Adam and Eve at 6,000 years ago. Given that the Bering Land Bridge flooded about 11,000 years ago, how and when do you see the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas entering into the genealogical lineage of your Adam and Eve? So this has to do with the question of migration patterns, Josh. How is your hypothesis consistent with the migration of ancient peoples?
Yeah, so I'll just give a very quick answer, and I think there's two pieces of it. One is on the scientific side, this is really interesting. It just turns out that what you just presented is just an incomplete view of what we found out. There's been a real ton of advances in ancient DNA where we've actually been able to show real strong evidence that there's been continuous exchange, probably by coastal route and also potentially over like a broken land bridge of islands between Asia and America during this time. And so it just turns out America wasn't nearly as cut off as we thought. The one place where there might have been a group of people cut off, where there's some debate, though I explain why I don't think it's definitive, is Tasmania. And it has to do not with the Bering Strait, but really with just the isolation of Tasmania. And there's a lot of details into that. I'd say that also is a really interesting to pursue. There's an article on my in my blog called "The Isolation of Tasmania" that you can get a little more information about that on. The book has a whole chapter on that. Also, one of the scientific articles I published on this gets into this in detail. But the key thing is that science doesn't really clarify, or the evidence, I should say, doesn't really clarify and to what extent Tasmania was cut off. Now, that's the first point. There's a lot of really cool science. It's complex, and I'm going to just put that into a box right now and push it aside. The bigger issue is, I would say, that you said that I have a model that locates Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago. That's actually not true. I'm not presenting a model. And this is just going to be hard for people to accept, but I'm not doing that. I'm just presenting what's possible. And one bracket on the range of what's possible is Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago. But there's very good reasons to imagine Adam and Eve 10,000 years ago, or even 15,000 years ago. And though I don't fully understand it, Bill takes that to the extreme and puts Adam and Eve about 700,000 years ago. So I'm not actually saying that they were 6,000 years ago. I'm saying that even if they were 6,000 years ago, we would be ancestors of everyone. But of course, they could be more ancient than that as well. So that really relieves a lot of tension. It just means now we can have the question about, well, when did they live, without having to worry about genetics anymore. And this gets to the question about, was I being disingenuous by saying I don't care about Adam and Eve per se? Well, I really don't actually care where someone locates them. I just don't care. The only reason I care is because I'm trying to love my neighbor, and they seem to really care. And I see a gigantic quagmire in a fight here, and I just think rather than I'm not going to put any I'm not going to die on the hill of what age or when Adam and Eve lived. That's not my hill to die on. But I can see a lot of my friends and a lot of people I care about who care about that question, and so I just want to be truthful to them as a scientist. So it's So why would I write a book about this, Ken? It's because I'm trying to love my neighbor, who seems to care about Adam and Eve.
We have a question here for Ken Miller. Might not superfluous theology serve a very important purpose in helping people to affirm various Christian doctrines, perhaps even core doctrines, in variegated ways? That is to say, it is likely that not everyone will approach specific doctrines in the exact same manner, and so various explanations of doctrinal points might be very helpful to the overall life of the church. I have in mind here something like Bill Craig's neo-Apollinarianism, and that he need not think that it is true in order for it to be useful in rebutting certain critiques of the possibility of the incarnation. Alternatively, a question about why Oliver Crisp should be proposing new explanations of old doctrines instead of simply proposing new doctrines. In his book, Analyzing Doctrine, at that EPS panel last night was asked, and a similar response to this one was given. Ken, do you have any comment?
Yeah, no, I certainly understand the term superfluous theology in this particular case. I have to admit I'm not familiar with Oliver Crisp, so that reference is lost to me, and I apologize for that. But my concern about this particular issue is that the system that Josh has presented is, in effect, I think, designed to rescue the Adam and Eve story by pointing out that it's entirely possible that they existed, that they were divinely created by God, and that we all share genealogical descent from them. Well, that's fine. What you've done then is you've rescued a particular part of Genesis. But my point is that there are other parts of Genesis, and that was my point about the sequence of creation events day by day, which are really not consistent with natural history. Well, Adam and Eve deserve rescue. Why don't they deserve rescue as well? And then finally, going on from that, and let's talk about Georges Lemaitre and the Big Bang, cosmic expansion, and so forth. That's not anticipated in Scripture either. Do we also need to rescue that the creation event in Genesis, which presumably occurred recently, with the idea that the universe, yes, had a beginning, but it's very, very old. So it's certainly true, it's an empirical fact, that Christians of all sorts understand theological doctrines in a whole variety of ways. The incarnation is one, the virgin birth is another, the resurrection is indeed another. So maybe superfluous theology would be strategically useful in maintaining the big tent of the Christian denomination broadly understood. But I think in terms of being intellectually honest in the way that I would understand a reading of Scripture, I don't think that superfluous theology serves a valid point. I would much rather, as Josh said, and I think these were his words, or at least the way that I wrote them down, Genesis is a sacred history, not a natural history and not a scientific history. I completely and totally agree. My point is, let's leave it there as sacred history. And I think that enables a complete appreciation of that sacred history by allowing a full embrace of science.
Okay. I don't see any new.
Yeah, there is
questions.
a question.
There are more.
Rayner. How would you respond to young earth creationists who say that you take Genesis 1 less literally than the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 and 3? That's a great question, and it actually speaks to what Ken is just discussing as well. What I'd say is, first of all, we need to not adopt a wooden literalism that's based on the English translation. When I talk about literalism, I'm defining it based on the Chicago statements. Okay, and a key thing to understand is that science is just a very bizarre way of understanding the world. We care about precision in a way that is not normal to the human experience. It's just not normal. It has to be taught to students. No one is born thinking like a scientist in this way. It's part of the acculturation, the bizarrety of science, the degree of precision we care about. unless maybe you're autistic or no, but who knows? Maybe some of the early scientists were autistic. That maybe that's how it happened. All right, but regardless, I think when you keep that in mind, we just can't ask it to do things from our modern point of view. We have to actually see it how people back in a pre-scientific time were writing. Now, this whole question of it being sacred history, I do think that, and this is, I think, what young Earth creationists are really getting at. They're asking not whether or not, fundamentally, whether or not we can take it scientifically or literally in this wooden way. They're really asking is, does this refer to a real reality in the physical world? What I'd say is that a better way to describe them is maybe theologically is that they're scriptural realists. And so and I think it actually does get back to the resurrection. A key component of conservative or Orthodox Christianity is the bodily resurrection of Jesus. A resurrection event, in quotes, is not enough. There's some connection between the sacred redemption story and what happened in the physical world that's important. So that's what creates the tension between science and the Christian faith, is how does sacred history connect to the physical world? And that's what they're really asking. And so what I think we have to do is just actually look at what the tradition of the Christian faith actually teaches and what literal readings actually are. And one place that really was a big turning point for me was reading St. Augustine's literal interpretation of Genesis and finding out that that interpretation of Genesis looked nothing like young Earth creationism. His literal reading of Genesis, long before science, not for the reason of interacting with evolution or whatever, just was nothing. It was unrecognizable to young Earth creationists. So even a literal reading, there's many literal readings. And the literal reading that's consistent, not with wooden literalism of anti-evolutionism, but the actual Chicago statements and historical Christianity held by people like, for example, Ken Keathley, there just isn't a conflict there. And so that's what I would start by. And then also just point out that the historic conflict has never really been about Genesis 1. It's always been about Genesis 2. That's what the fight's been about. It's always been about Adam and Eve. It has not really been about the 6 days of creation.
Here's a question. He asks, why is it that the New Testament does not enter into this question at all? What could be said about that? Can we change the hermeneutics on the way? This question might be for genetics and exegetes. And I would like to augment that question by pointing out that it seems very plausible, I think, that the historical Jesus believed in a historical Adam and Eve. He refers to them. If we deny the historicity of Adam and Eve, do we really have the temerity to correct Jesus of Nazareth, to say that he was mistaken in his beliefs about this? And if he was mistaken, what does that imply for his divinity?
Well, I mean, if some variant of the genealogical Adam and Eve is true, then Jesus wasn't in error in anything he said or believed. I mean, he didn't talk about whether or not there were people outside the garden. That's something he's silent about. And, so we don't really know what he thought. And so if he thought Adam and Eve were real historical people in a real past from whom we all descend, he would have been right. So I don't actually know why I would be in conflict with Jesus. Now, I'd also point out there's...
Not you, Josh. I'm thinking of people like Ken Miller and Greg Kutsona, who seem to suggest that this was
a good question for them,
dispensable.
Yeah. My answer would be a very brief one, and that is that Jesus did not come to teach us quantum mechanics, nuclear physics, or molecular biology, or even the natural history of the earth or our species. He came to save our souls. And the fact that he spoke in the cultural context of the time in which Adam and Eve were regarded as the ancestors of the human race is entirely appropriate. And as John Calvin said, had Jesus spoken in ways that assumed facts not in evidence to people living at the time, his message would have been ignored.
Before this panel, I didn't realize how much I was going to appreciate Ken Miller. Let me just say that my emphasis has been all on Josh's book and his presentation. So my own viewpoint was very minimally described. And one of the things I would have said more clearly is I don't mind if what I call position 2 is true, that there is a historical Adam and Eve within the evolutionary science. Josh knows this. I've said it many, many times. And I can only say that I've written about this in other areas to tell you why, like other Christians who hold to this, like James Dunn or C.S. Lewis or Francis Collins. So,
well, to be clear, Francis Collins holds to a historical Adam. He clarified that this year, actually.
You know, that's not what I heard in a recording, so that's fine. We can leave him aside, but that was not the data I have on him. It's great if he does. That's fine. Like I said, it's fine if people do. And one of the things when you both were talking about wondering where I came out, I didn't really want to come out with any perspective. I just wanted to say that a non-historical Adam is a legitimate part of Orthodox Christianity. That was my key point. I'd love to go into the text from Jesus. I think they could be interpreted. We should go into the interpretation of those texts. That's the best way to do it. I think it would take time.
And you're right that the focus in this session has been quite appropriately upon Josh Swamidass's book. And I want to thank all of you for your participation in this session. We've now come to the end of our time. And so we'll leave you all with our thanks for an excellent session.
Yeah, thanks for attending too. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to read the book and respond.
Thanks to everyone. This is a really very, very interesting and productive discussion. I appreciate being part of it. Thank you.
Thank you.